Hello, I am Claire Casey, and today I will be presenting on the topic of the Neskantaga First Nations water crisis. To start things off, I'm going to give an overview of the presentation. The water pump that the community uses broke down in early September, which left the community in a state of emergency. The lack of help that the community received from Indigenous Services Canada was startling and relates to the continuous lack of intervention that the government takes with the Indigenous communities of Canada. Neskantaga has been without clean tap water for the past 25 years, and larger contributions have been made in terms of Indigenous communities' water security in order to reconcile their colonial past. The facts of the story. The Neskantaga community has been under a boil water advisory for the past 25 years, which is the longest boil water advisory Canada has experienced in history. On September 16, 2019, the Neskantaga community in northwestern Ontario faced a major crisis. Two of their electric water pumps broke down, which left many without water and some with small unchlorinated amounts that are unsafe for personal use. The 25-year boil water advisory that the community has been facing quickly switched to a do not consume advisory. The crisis caused the closure of schools and the need for more than 100 inhabitants of the community to take emergency flights in order to treat health concerns such as skin infections from the untreated water. The Indigenous Services of Canada rejected giving support in terms of the emergency evacuations, but promised a working pump by the middle of the following week. The evacuated inhabitants returned home after the do not consume advisory was lifted and the water situation returned to the way it had been for the past 25 years. It is important to provide some historical context to this water crisis in order to understand the full story. During the colonial era in Canada, many Indigenous communities were relocated to northern parts of Ontario. Many of the communities that they were moved to did not have access to clean water, and they have continued to experience these poor living standards ever since. The Government of Canada created this issue for many communities, and they should be working to fix it, not only because clean water is a fundamental human right, but because we owe it to them. The Neskantaga community had a water filtration system installed in 1991. This system quickly failed after just 4 years due to its poor construction. In 1995, the community requested a new system to be installed, and it wasn't until 2017 that the federal government was able to secure the funds for the project. The new plant was supposed to be completed by mid-2018, but the contractors that were hired for the new job were soon fired due to their lack of commitment to the project. The government over the years has made many promises throughout history, and many promises have been broken. In 1977, Pierre Trudeau, during his time as Prime Minister, promised to provide physical infrastructure that was going to meet that of non-Indigenous neighboring communities. This promise was never followed through with due to lack of legislation to cover on-reserve needs such as education, health, and most importantly for this story, drinking water. Only small programs were approved and followed through with. This lack of legislation continued for many years, and in 2011, a status report for the Auditor General of Canada emphasized the confusion that Indigenous communities are experiencing in terms of the federal responsibility for funding them sufficiently. In 2015, this confusion was reiterated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. In this report, it was evident that one of the main issues many communities experience in terms of proper services on reserves is the lack of legislation that the government provides. Reserves found difficulty in planning and controlling services because the federal government was not holding themselves accountable when things went wrong and more funding was needed. This portion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission explains some of the reasons for the water crisis that many communities are experiencing. The lack of funding, the confusion about jurisdiction, and poor water management are the main factors affecting water security in Canadian Indigenous communities. When Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, one of his political promises was to lift all drinking water advisories in Canada by March 2021. On the positive end of things, since 2015, the government has been able to lift 87 advisories, but sadly, 37 have since been reintroduced. This emphasizes the poor infrastructure that the communities have have in terms of water filtration systems. In 2017, Nescantaga received $8.8 million in funding for a new water plant, but as mentioned before, the contractors did not succeed in completing their goal. Going forward, the new plant is supposed to be built by the end of November of this year. One of the issues that I mentioned in the previous slide was the confusion that many Indigenous communities face in terms of who is responsible for water security in each community. Water security is a shared responsibility between the federal government, the Indigenous communities, and the Ontario government. This collaboration is considered the Trilateral Technical Working Group. They have plans to eliminate all advisories at public, federally funded, on-reserve water systems. Ontario is considered the leader in this project, and they facilitate most of the design, construction, operations, maintenance, and management of the drinking water systems. Ontario has committed $1.85 million in funding through the Walkerton Clean Water Centre to provide training on reserves. A large issue that many reserves experience is the lack of expertise in terms of water filtration systems, and many break down due to their misuse. In terms of the federal government, they are in charge of infrastructure on reserves. Through researching the responsibility of water security in Canada, that the system is quite complex. This complexity leads to confusion and promises often falling through. Now I will speak about some of the legal issues at play within this news article and the Nescantaga water crisis as a whole. Having access to drinking water and healthy sanitation is a human right. The United Nations states that the right to water entitles everyone to have access to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal use and domestic use. Greater control by and for First Nations over water is a crucial step in reconciling with the Indigenous communities of Canada. The government has committed to eliminating all water advisories in Canada by March 2021, and this would be an amazing step towards implementing the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples concerning clean water access. There are an abundance of health concerns relating to the lack of clean water. What worries me is the lack of concern that the government had in terms of the Nescantaga community during their water crisis. When Indigenous Services Canada refused to help with the emergency evacuations, and the reasoning was that they believed that there were no immediate health or safety risks. What is considered a health concern to Indigenous Services Canada, and at what point will the government intervene? What consequences will the government face if they do not follow through with their goals? Will there be any compensation to the Indigenous communities who are being deprived of human rights? The federal government has a lot of control over First Nations communities and the funds that they receive regarding fixing infrastructure and other services that have high costs. Funds that are created for First Nations communities should be transferred directly to them in order to allow them to manage their own programs and services with support from our Canadian government. Indigenous peoples of Canada are interested in governing themselves, and this must be recognized in order to help reconciliation follow through. Canada should be helping First Nations in every way that they can, while also allowing them to be self-governed and making some of their own decisions. In terms of the importance of land regarding the Nescantaga community and the area of interaction of the community, many aspects come into play. The land that Nescantaga was originally situated on had spiritual roots, and the community was relocated by Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada in the late 1980s. With this move, the community was promised better services, including better water and sanitation. Their new water system was built in 1991, soon failed, and since 1995, the community has been under the boil water advisory. The community was forced to leave their spiritual roots, and the government could not follow through with many of their promises that they had set out. The area they are now situated on is very north in Ontario, which causes major issues when attempting to access healthcare facilities. The community's interaction with the government has always been promising, but in terms of their clean water, they have often been let down. This is the case for many other Indigenous communities across Canada. Nescantaga's experience with the law in Canada mirrors many other First Nations communities. In terms of the path forward, I am concerned with what will happen to the Nescantaga community. What will happen to the rest of water access in Indigenous communities in Ontario and in Canada as a whole? Thank you.